Hollow Knight is by far one of the most enjoyable games I have ever played. I always find myself coming back to it as my go-to game for when I am bored. Every time I play this game, I notice even more of the incredible work and detail that Team Cherry put into it. So I have decided to take it upon myself to make a completely arbitrary list on the best and worst areas that the game has to offer. I'm going to rank each area based on 3 separate categories: aesthetics, personal enjoyment, and first impressions. It should be obvious that this will be entirely opinion-based and will be judged based on my experiences with the game. If you have ordered them differently than I have, then feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments below. With that out of the way, I present to you my ranking of all the areas in Hollow Knight from worst to best. I feel like I should start out by saying that I don't think any of the areas in Hollow Knight are bad. Some areas just don't have the same impact on me as others. As far as Green Path is concerned, it just feels like a chore to go through. It is essentially the second area of the game, and after coming off of the first area, I'm feeling pretty great. I've just beaten my first boss, gotten a new spell, really just overall gotten used to the mechanics of the game. And then, in comes Green Path. It feels like everything slows down here, and I start to feel how linear the early game really is. There are some optional things to do here, but a lot of them you won't be able to do your first time through. By the time you have all the upgrades necessary to obtain everything here, it's almost too easy. I never feel excited to go to or to revisit Green Path. The area does of course look amazing, as is the case with the entire game. But after playing the game a few times and knowing what is to come later, it feels a little out of place. The lush grass and the bright colors seem to heavily contrast the rest of the game. I give Green Path a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 2 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 2 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 11 out of 30. It is worth noting that Green Path does have some of the best music in the game, but ultimately that does not save it from being boring and uninteresting to me. The first time I played this game, I remember dying to Umas way more than I should have, and then completely forgetting Fog Canyon existed after that. There isn't a whole lot to do here on your first run through, and it is quite a bit later in the game when you finally do need to come back. I have spent maybe a total of 20 minutes in this area throughout all the times I've played this game, which is a huge part of why it's ranked so low. There isn't much here worth remembering. If it weren't for the fact that the enemies don't seem to be bugs, but rather some sort of jellyfish creatures, then I would probably still forget what this area even is. It feels very detached from the rest of the game, and I'm honestly not sure what Team Cherry was going for here. Obviously, being called Fog Canyon, this area is full of fog, which to me really takes away from the overall look and feel of the area. Nowhere else in the game really has this, and the fact that it is wedged right in the middle of everything is so odd. I give Fog Canyon a 6 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 4 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 2 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 12 out of 30. The resting grounds suffer from the same kind of thing that the Fog Canyon does, in that it is a very small area and you have no real reason to return to it very often. The most interesting thing to me is the Spirit's Glade, that you unlock after collecting 200 essence with your Dream Nail. Talking to all the spirits and learning a bit more about the world is really interesting, but after having done it once, there isn't much reason to do it again. Once you have obtained the Dream Nail, you can basically leave and never return, especially if you're not going for a true ending run. The Blue Lake is a very visually pleasing part of the resting grounds, but there isn't really anything to do there. What little there is of the area does look very nice, and for the most part, it's a pretty peaceful place to be. But ultimately, there just isn't enough reason to explore and keep your attention here. I give the Resting Grounds a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 3 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 3 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 13 out of 30. So, I almost didn't add Godhome as an area at all, seeing as there isn't a whole lot here. But upon asking one other person their opinion on if I should add it or not, I decided it deserved a spot. It is nice to see all the statues of the game's bosses, and the inclusion of Godhome is a very welcome addition, but it really serves less as a new area to explore and more of an arena to fight the bosses. I personally am bad at fighting most, if not all, the bosses, so this area never really resonated with me. It does earn points by having the Eternal Ordeal in it though, which is one of the best parts of the game. I give Godhome a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 3 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 4 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 14 out of 30. I remember being about 40 hours into my first playthrough of the game thinking that I've seen it all, and then I happened to shoot a hiveling with my Shade Soul, and it opened up a brand new area I've never seen before. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. That is, until I got around to exploring it a bit. The hive is exactly what you would expect. It is a beehive with an assortment of bee enemies. By this point, I had seen areas made of crystal, a large city, and even a grand coliseum. So imagine my disappointment when I discovered the beehive. Once I got over all that though, I discovered that the hive is actually quite fun. The enemy's ability to break platforms added a nice new twist to the platforming. It was just a shame that it was over before it really took off. I give the hive a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 5 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 3 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 15 out of 30. I know what you may be thinking. LemonDuck, Dirtmouth is a single screen with nothing going on. Why is it so much higher on the list than some other areas? That is true, but where it does gain points for me is in introducing you to the fact that there is more to this world than just swinging your nail around killing enemies. Team Cherry kind of just literally drops you into the game and gives you no real goal or direction. Since there's only one way to go, you'll eventually make your way to Dirtmouth. This is where you learn that there are going to be NPCs to talk to. Seeing all the closed doors had opened up a world of possibilities for me because I knew that this was just the beginning of something amazing. The world seemed so bleak, and you could tell right away that you were going on a grand adventure. Once you rescue some villagers and open everything up in town, it feels like such a nice cozy place to be. Coming back to Dirtmouth always felt like returning home to me. I would be doing an injustice if I didn't mention the Grimm Troop and their little setup on the edge of town as well. Grimm himself being one of, if not the most fun boss to fight. As the game goes on, the town gets more lively based on things you have done, and made me feel as though I truly was making a difference. I give Dirtmouth a 6 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 4 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 6 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 16 out of 30. If there were not giant letters on the screen that told me I had entered into a new area, then I would have sworn I just found my way back into Greenpath. Queen's Garden to me is essentially just a much more dangerous version of Greenpath. What sets Queen's Garden apart for me though is the fact that I do genuinely enjoy going through it. The platforming aspect of this game is by far my favorite part, and this area really makes sure that you pay attention to your movement. There are thorns and falling platforms everywhere, and the enemy placement makes it just that much more interesting to go through. What I said before about Green Path still applies to Queen's Garden, in that it does feel a little bit out of place for me, but there is enough different about it that the area doesn't feel too jarring. I give Queen's Garden a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 7 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 3 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 17 out of 30. The Forgotten Crossroads is the first main area outside of Dirtmouth, and as such is home to a lot of firsts. This is where we will meet some valuable NPCs for the first time. We fight our first boss here. I died for the first time here. It is a very impactful area, and it teaches you the basics of the game in a very easy to understand manner. Whether or not you find it all easy to do may be another story. There are slight branches and paths you can take, but you are mostly going to be forced towards the first boss of the game. These little branches give you a sense of wonder and clue you in that there will be a lot to explore and upgrades to be obtained to help you get to new places. Eventually, as you play further into the game, the crossroads and the enemies within it will become infected. This makes for a fun twist, and it makes the first area of the game feel new and interesting again, while also adding a little more difficulty to it. Since you will be coming through this area a lot, it is nice to have it change things up. I give the Forgotten Crossroads a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 5 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 6 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 18 out of 30. The Howling Cliffs is technically where you start the game. It isn't until later that the game actually tells you the name of the location or lets you explore more than a little bit of it, but I remember making my way here and having a great time exploring while simultaneously platforming up the cliffs to find that you can access the very first section of the game. That long drop down that you see in the opening moments of the game can be experienced again anytime you want. It added a nice sense of world building, where the start of the game isn't just some arbitrary dead end somewhere, with no real explanation of how you got there. On top of that, the rest of the area gives you the sense that there is so much more out in the world, besides what the game lets you see and explore. To me, the Howling Cliffs added more mystery to the game, and that has stuck with me throughout each time I've come back to it. I give the Howling Cliffs a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 6 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 6 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 19 out of 30. Motherfucking primal aspids. Crystal Peak is definitely one of the more unique looking areas. The bright pink colors and slight step up in difficulty at this point in the game makes this area a lot of fun for me. The overall theme of the area being a mining site makes sense, and the enemy design really seems to fit. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this area, mostly due to the fact that I've lost several Steel Soul runs here. I underestimate it every time. Aside from that though, I've always enjoyed coming through this area. I love the way you have to ascend as you first enter, and then descend on the other side to make progress. It has a nice rewarding feel upon getting to the Crystal Dash that many other areas fail to do for me. It is certainly not without flaws, of course. For a larger area of the game, it lacks any real kind of boss, aside from the Crystal Guardian, which is kind of anticlimactic. I remember being nervous as I got further and further through there, that I would get wrecked by some scary boss, and it never happened. I give Crystal Peak an 8 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 7 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 6 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 21 out of 30. Fungal Waste has so many little things in it that I enjoy that helped push it up as high as it is. It is a huge step up in enjoyment for me after leaving Green Path and the Fog Canyon. The journey through the mushroom-infested area is a total joy to experience. The enemies are more interesting, the platforming feels better, and the overall relief of getting out of those earlier areas are just the start of what makes Fungal Waste such a pleasure. As you make your way through, you'll eventually find the Mantis Village, which is home to the Mantis Claw, and once you obtain that, then the game really opens up for you. The Mantis Village is also home to my personal favorite boss in the game, the Mantis Lords. You can also find Leg Eater here, who will sell you breakable charms, which make the game that much easier and, to me, more enjoyable. I give Fungal Wastes a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, an 8 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 7 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 22 out of 30. To start out the top 5 of my list, I had to choose the Royal Waterways. I am the type of person that has always liked the addition of sewer levels. Something about the hidden underside of a city or town is intriguing to me. On the one side, it's just a sewer where the daily waste from above ends up. But on the other hand, there are nooks and crannies that hide secrets all without. The Dung Defender and the Flukemar make their appearance here, and they are definitely the funniest bosses, which is a nice change of pace from the intense and in-your-face bosses of the rest of the game. The area does a great job of feeling gross and uncomfortable with both visuals and the enemies, and yet somehow invokes this sense of wonder at what could be further inside. It feels like there is a lot to find relative to the amount of space it has, and it is just up to you to discover it. I give the Royal Waterways an 8 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 7 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and an 8 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 23 out of 30. The White Palace is a beautiful location. I feel like the game does a great job of portraying it as a once grand kingdom. The white lights coming through the windows and the overall brightness of everything gives me a sort of holy feeling. Everything here feels important and helps to bring the story as a whole together. As I have mentioned before, the platforming is my favorite part of the game, which in turn makes the White Palace my favorite place to play in. The entire area is riddled with saws, spikes, and thorns, which is oddly both why I love this place and why I have to take points away from it. From a platforming perspective, this area is a ton of fun. It also has the Path of Pain, which is a true test of your platforming skills and feels incredible to get through. That being said though, from a design aspect, The inclusion of all these dangerous contraptions feels out of place for a palace where the king resides. I cannot help but think of how unlikely it is for any of the royals or servants to make it through any of the obstacles in the way. I give White Palace an 8 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 10 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 7 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 25 out of 30. As much as I love the bright, calming ambience of the White Palace, where my heart really lies is with the more dark and spooky side of things. Deep Nest is just that kind of place. It is crawling with the world's most terrifying creatures, spiders. The eerie atmosphere is only enhanced by the enemy design here, and I'm all for it. This was the first area I felt nervous to move forward in. It really helped that the whole area felt like a giant maze, and there was a distinct lack of save spots. A nice sense of fear is something I truly enjoy, and it feels like it belongs in this game with its darker tones. The most interesting sequence of the game was finding the lead up to Nosk. Seeing what you think is yourself walking around set such a good atmosphere and built up tension perfectly. It's just unfortunate that Nosk itself is such a boring fight. I give Deep Nest a 9 out of 10 for aesthetics, an 8 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 9 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 26 out of 30. I have to admit that the last thing I expected to see as I made my way through this game about bugs was an intricate city. I remember being in awe the first time I got to the City of Tears. It is a giant area that keeps on giving. The rain coming from what I can only assume to be the blue lake above gives the area a nice relaxing feel and adds a somber tone. Most of the enemies in the area have more of a humanoid feel to them, showing that they are residents of the city as opposed to just creatures that inhabit the world. It feels more alive and confirms for the player that there's more going on than it may have seemed at first. There are several little sub-areas in the City of Tears, such as the Soul Sanctum, the Watcher's Spire, and the Tower of Love, that all add to what makes this area so great as a whole. There is also one of my absolute favorite backgrounds, which is the Memorial Fountain to the Hollow Knight. I give the City of Tears a 9 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 9 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 9 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 27 out of 30. When I first entered into the ancient basin, I thought, how much further down could this possibly go? It was starting to feel suffocating, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread. I made my way further and came across the broken vessel. The thought of this poor vessel meeting his end, and then being overrun by infection and not being in control anymore, broke my little heart. I knew almost nothing about them, but I felt like they deserved better. Sometime after I had beaten him, I unlocked the true reason the Ancient Basin is ranked number 1, and that is the Abyss. Making my way even deeper into the darkness was so exciting. The siblings and the void tendrils perfectly encapsulates the dark and scary kind of enemy that I honestly wish the game had more of. Then upon learning that the countless piles of corpses are in fact your siblings, hence the name of the enemy Shades, I began to realize that the fate of the broken vessel is even more upsetting. The fate and purpose of the vessels is a tragic tale, and the Abyss does an excellent job of getting that point across. I give Ancient Basin a 9 out of 10 for aesthetics, a 9 out of 10 for personal enjoyment, and a 10 out of 10 for first impressions, leaving it with a score of 28 out of 30. I hope you enjoyed my ranking of the areas in Hollow Knight. This was the first video in this style that I've ever done, so if you liked it, please be sure to let me know. I plan to do more stuff like this in the future, so your opinions can really help me to know what kind of things you liked and what you didn't like. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.